Alright, welcome to Advanced Old Testament Research. This is your final review. So go ahead and print this out and we'll go ahead and work our way through this. Alright, number one. List and describe the two most common ways that people try to use archaeological discoveries. So what I want here is something to the effect that you can either use it as an apologetic, right, to defend the word, or you can use it in a descriptive manner to describe the world of antiquity. Right. Number two, explain why dig sites must be developed in stages. This is basically the idea that civilizations built one upon the other, and so you have to take your dig site in stages of development. So you can't just dig all the way down to the age that you want, or that you find to be the most interesting. You have to take it a time period at a time, excavate it completely according to that time period, and then go below that and record everything, because often in order to get to something below the time period you're working on, you have to remove most of the time period that you're working on, right? And so for us it may be tantalizing to go straight to the time of David or something, but then we would lose all of the periods in between in that deep of a dig if we just went straight to it, right? Okay. Number three, how many of the kings of Israel and Judah have been archaeologically verified? That was 22 out of the 29. We have found their name or something connected to them specifically, right? 22 of 29. Number four, explain why digs in Jerusalem show massive expansion of the city during the 7th and 8th centuries. So basically what we're after here is something to the effect that when Israel was destroyed, the northern 10 tribes, when their capital cities were destroyed, many of the people fled to Jerusalem. And during Hezekiah's time and other periods, it appears that the tribes were essentially united. It was still called Judah, but it was essentially all of them took shelter under the only king remaining, which would have been the king of Judah. Right? Okay. Number five, what was the significance of the pyramid of Amenhotep III discussed in class? It's funny because it's one of the pyramids that was destroyed with time. It basically fell apart, his entire pyramid. This was the one that Moses fled from. Grew up about the same age as Moses, and Moses fled from him in the wilderness for 40 years. His pyramid essentially did nothing, and so or didn't stand the test of time. And the irony is, or the connection with the biblical passage, is that he was one of the pharaohs that insisted on building everything with slave labor and mud bricks, right? And so the mud bricks didn't stand the test of time. Number six, what has archaeology explained about the invasion under Joshua? So a couple of things. Two things come to mind. One, that they primarily inhabited the highlands, right? That there was still somewhat of a fear and apprehension about engaging the enemy in the plains because they didn't have chariot technology. And number two, that just like the Bible said, Joshua and them did not destroy most of the cities that they defeated. They killed the people and moved on, and then came back later and re-inhabited the cities because they're looking for places to live. There was nothing to be gained from destroying the infrastructure. They destroyed some under the command of God. When God told them specifically to destroy a city, they would. Other than that, they left them intact because they wanted to use the buildings later. Once the main military campaign had ended, everyone was going to go back to these cities to live. And so it was much better to just leave the buildings standing. Many people then, though, take that as if Joshua and them never swept through and killed everyone because there's no evidence of destruction. But if you read the Bible carefully, there wouldn't have been evidence of destruction because that's not what they were doing. Alright, number 8. or 7 rather. Explain why there is not much archaeological information discovered about David and Solomon. So we're after something to the effect that that number one, in that whole time period, we don't have much from anybody, from Moab, Ammon, Philistines. I mean, we just that time period in general, we have yet to discover a lot from. A couple of reasons for that. One, specifically in Israel, less than 5% of archaeological sites have actually been excavated. And of that, as we discussed, there's different time periods, so the majority of the 5% that have been excavated have not been excavated down to the time of David and Solomon. So there's a very small percentage of usable information from that period in terms of what we've dug down to find. And then number two, a lot of our kings of Israel that have been noted are after David and Solomon because they were noted not from archaeological discoveries in Jerusalem and in Israel, but from references to them from archaeological discoveries in Assyria. And so Assyria was, a large nation. They kept a lot of records, and so their dealings with Israel and Judah are recorded very clearly. But they didn't begin to interact with this part of the world. Assyria didn't until after the time of Solomon. And so it just stands to reason that the main source of information that we have was the records that Assyria was keeping, and they weren't in this part of the world during the time of David and Solomon. All right, number 8, list and describe the 3 items found that relate to David. Right, so in that video, I kind of gave you a few things that we had found specific to David. One of them was the Tel Dan stela. Right, that was from Tel Dan. There was a stela there that mentions the house of David. And then there's the stela of Mesha, the king of Moab. That one mentions the house of David. Then Shoshank, one of the pharaohs of Egypt, mentions the heights of Dawit, DWT, which was the Egyptian way of saying David, as being in the Negev. Right, so he's 50 years after David, and during Solomon's time, right around Rehoboam, and at that time he's calling those hills in the Negev, that wilderness that David was hiding in when he was fleeing from Saul and all of that, that had become known as the hills of Dawit, which is Egyptian for David. And then another possible one that you could put in there is there's an Assyrian inscription that describes Hadadezer as king of Aram, right? And so David isn't mentioned by name, but one of his main enemies is mentioned as name. So it doesn't necessarily, it's not one that specifically relates to David, but this is David's main enemy, and so to find a reference to him was important also, right? Okay, number 9, historically the tithe was paid to whom? The king, right? So that's something that we've kind of lost in today's culture, that the tithe has become just a religious obligation, as opposed to understanding that it was a kingdom obligation, something that you give to the king. Historically, kings collected a tithe. And so it is not something just for your local church. It's not just something for a religious duty that you have to get done. This is what is owed to the king, right, from your income. What color was Israelite pottery? All of their pottery was a washed out red color, right? Number 11, list the 2 revelations from the Amarna letters given in class. So the Amarna letters talk about the Apiru, right? Which we believe very well might have been a reference to the Hebrew, or at least a general classification of people that were very similar to the Hebrews. It talked about them as being wandering nomads and shepherds. And so it also says that they were a large displaced people who invaded Canaan in the 14th century, which is exactly when Israel invaded, right? And so, but it's interesting during that time. So a couple of things that we find. One is that's the discussion of Laban you. Remember Laban, Y-U, Laban you of Shechem, right? So potentially related to the Laban's, as maybe perhaps Jacob abandoned Shechem. Did Laban's people take over? I don't know. But where Jacob used to live is a tribe of people who trace their history back to someone named Laban, right? And he was one of their leaders. And he, when the Israelites or the Apiru returned, this large group of people that came into Canaan with no home, this massive migration of people that showed up, the guy that was in charge of Shechem opened up the city to these Apiru, right? So it seems that that if this is the Israelites, that whoever this was, for some reason had a reason to not fight and wanted to just give them the city, right? And so that's kind of an interesting part. And then one of the other things that we learned from the Apiru is that we learned that discussion about Abraham and how we talked about how the Apiru were often described as wandering shepherds with some trained military, that kind of thing. And so we kind of get a picture of Abraham and his traveling group, perhaps David and his traveling group. We see that Esau doing the same thing, that Esau had trained men. Perhaps that explains why Jacob was scared of him, that the same kind of trained force that David had or that Abraham had, that Esau had developed one as well. Okay. So that's the two main things. A discussion about the Apiru and Laban, and then possibly the military side of it, as we see in Abraham, David, and Esau. All right, number 12. What was significant about Punon? Punon was interesting because that was a place that even today is a major copper mining area, and that's right in the same spot where Moses had the bronze serpent, which would have used copper, perhaps from that area. So anyways, whether there's a connection there or not, I'm not sure, but it is kind of interesting that in that region, copper was very abundant, right? Okay. Discuss the comparison given in class between the tribe of Dan and the Philistines. So this is one I'll give you just the overall thing, but you may have to go back and look. But it was the basic idea that it was not Philistines in the tribe of Dan's territory that they were to remove. It was Canaanites. The Amorite tribes, which was a Canaanite group, were living in the area that Dan was supposed to take, and Dan never displaced them, and instead Dan moved north and pretty much abandoned their inheritance for the most part and went and lived and took over Laish and turned it into the city of Dan in the far reaches of the north. And so, but then the interesting thing is then that later, just a few hundred years later, the Amorites are not there, and it's the Philistines that are there, which then means that the Philistines displaced the Amorites when they showed up and took over those towns that were supposed to be Dan's. So I think it's kind of interesting, the comparison between Dan and the Philistines, or the Israelites and the Philistines, that both of them are people groups looking for an inheritance. And the Israelites had the Lord on their side and never took those cities. They abandoned them and they left. Whereas the Philistines moved in and took over that inheritance. And so it's just kind of interesting, the comparison between the Philistines and the Israelites, that they are two groups. The Philistines trying to do it in their own strength, the Israelites supposed to be doing it by faith in the Lord. And sometimes they did and sometimes they didn't. You get a tribe like Dan looked at the cities of the Amorites and said, there's no way we can take that. And they fled. And then the Philistines come in and look at the city of the Amorites and say, we got to take it. And they took it, So it just goes to show you that that they were there for the taking if the Israelites had trusted the Lord. Okay. Explain how the history of Midian validates the biblical record. Well, what I mean by that is Midian disappeared after about 600 or 700 A.D. And so if the Bible had been written, as some people would try to contend, hundreds of years after the events happened, they wouldn't have even known about Midian, because Midian disappeared from the record, right? And so if this was the work of later scribes, right, as some people would try and say that, oh, it's just a history that was made up after the fact, they wouldn't have even known about Midian during that time period, because Midian had disappeared from the archaeological record. Nobody would have used them. They would have used whatever group was living there at the time as the example, right? So anyways, there's lots of examples like that in the Bible where specific details are given that a later group would have had no way of even knowing, which tends to locate the authorship of those passages during the generations that experienced what happened, right? Otherwise, later generations wouldn't have even known many of these historical details that our archaeology is now proving correct, right? Because they weren't doing archaeology back then. They didn't have access to many of the things that we have now, and we're validating the stories through archaeology. And so we know about the Midians, but most of the people during that time wouldn't have known about that tribe that had disappeared hundreds of years earlier. Okay. 15. In your own words, list, describe, and give an example, so 3 things, of 4 of the principles given in class for reading a text. So I did several videos on this about principles that could be applied to reading an Old Testament text. So what I want you to do is give me the principle, kind of explain it a little bit. That's the list and describe. And then for each one of these, I gave you a scriptural example applying that principle, right? So give me it can be the one I gave in class, that's fine. But I want you to give me 4 of these. Tell me what the principle is, describe it a little bit, and give me a scriptural example, right? So that's one you'll want to go back in and look at. 16. List the 3 principles given for drawing out theological points. So what I'm after here, I'll go ahead and just give them to you. It's just a quick description of them. Look for revelations of God's name. That was one that I gave you. The other one was look for underlying principles in God's law. And then the third one, or look at God's promises, because those are a reflection of His will, right? All right, 17. Discuss 2 principles given in class for understanding the law genre of the Old Testament. So you want to go back in and look at that. We did an entire video on that where I kind of gave you different principles about how do we apply the law portions of Scripture and how do we draw principles and understand that genre, right? Okay. 18. List and describe in your own words 3 important applications of the discovery of El Hammam. Okay, so this one is the third one that I want you to do on your own. I'm not going to give you too much on this one, but I'll explain to you what I mean by important applications. So an example of an important application of knowing that El Hammam is Sodom, we understand now where it is. One might be that story of Elijah and Elisha. It takes place right near that. And so there was scriptural applications and revelation that we get on the Elijah story because we now know where Sodom actually is. And it sheds light on Elijah and Elisha's story when Elijah is taken to heaven because it happens in the same spot, right? And so there's a few other stories like that that I gave you that are really neat applications now that we can draw from when we can more accurately place Sodom. So now that we know that Sodom was right there on the other side of Jericho, it gives us lots of neat scriptural revelation. Okay. Number 19. So I want 3 of those. Give me 3 good scriptural revelations from that. Number 19. What does kikar mean? So that is like, it means disc, or round, circle. And so that is the word used to describe the field, the plain, if you will, of the watered part of the Jordan that Abraham and Lot were looking at. So basically Lot's saying, or Abraham's saying, you take one side, I'll take the other. Most likely he's referring to the Jordan. You take one side of the Jordan, and I'll take the other, and that's what they did. Lot went to the east side of the Jordan and took the plain cities of Sodom. Lot went to the west side of the Jordan and took the area near Jericho and Jerusalem. Okay. Alright, number 21. Discuss how an understanding of how prophets transmitted their revelations can be used as an apologetic. Basically what I'm after is that last video we talked about how prophets would often write their revelations down immediately, and how that, now that we know that is very different from what people were trying to say over the last 100 years about prophets and how they didn't write these things down until way later and stuff like that. So that's in that last video. Number 22, what is the significance of comparing the story of God healing Hezekiah and God delivering Jerusalem? So the basic idea in that is also that last video of looking at how these two stories took place at the same time, basically, within the same year. And that Hezekiah's fall is, in the last 15 years, is made that much more dramatic because both of these powerful stories happened right before he fell. And then he fell away from God, essentially, after two of the greatest things that could happen in his life happened, right? And so that's in the last video as well. Okay, so you should be good. If you have any questions, feel free to email me.